Here. Obviously, our topic du jour is going to be the 16th century, and I would say right away, just keep it as simple as possible. It doesn't sound like this is the kind of mistake that you would hear about a lot, but I've had this happen where a student would actually field a question on the 16th century and then write about the 1600s. And you know what? It can be an honest mistake, you know, and it's disaster. So I would strongly advise you to go ahead and if they try to do that in any free response question, just write on the exam. Just make it easy for yourself and just put 1500s, because that's going to be a lot easier for you, and it's going to make life a lot better for you. And just in case, and the girl was honest enough to tell me that she came back just absolutely in tears, saying, you know, I wrote a great essay, 100 years off. Oh, wow. Okay, so anyway, tonight we're looking at kind of some, obviously, you know, things don't happen in a nice 100-year block. You know, nothing really begins and ends in that time. So we're going to talk a little bit about overlap. The overlap, of course, is going to be the Renaissance. That's the big overlap in the 1500s. And I would argue that's really when you're getting into the high Renaissance, when you start looking at the work of Michelangelo at Vatican and the Sistine Chapel and things like that. That's all occurring. All the great sculptures are happening in the 1500s. So we have that in mind. We also want to keep in mind, as we juggle that ball, we also know that the Reformation is also occurring simultaneously. So while Michelangelo is working in the Sistine Chapel, we've got Luther, and we've got a real firestorm occurring. In the last session where we met, we talked about the fact that we established the Reformation really earlier with John Wycliffe in England in the 1300s. We've got Jan Hus in the 1400s in Bohemia. So again, we don't have a nice, clean, easy start date for the Reformation, but most historians are going to put it at 1517 with Luther. But I think we want to keep in mind that, again, what's going to separate you from the average student on the exam, if you can articulate a depth of understanding that you realize that the Reformation and the seeds of the Reformation are sown before Luther's his 95 Theses, and that, again, separates you from the pack, and that's something you always want to try to do. So we begin looking at the 1500s, and I'm looking primarily, we're going to talk, obviously, thematically, Renaissance, counter-ref, and then the success of the Age of Exploration, the rise of Spain, and its ultimate debacle. And poor fiscal managing, and just a rather sad situation for Spain as they're going to send their ships to the bottom of the channel in 1588, and by the time we escape from this century, Spain will be on a decline. So that being said, your timeline and your chunk. For those of you that are here for the first time, one of the reasons why I do this, I've been grading the AP exam since 1999, and one of the things that I found consistently helpful for students is having a depth and breadth of knowledge of a century of history. Reason being is if you can find anything good from our discussion in these review sessions that will give you a good solid feel about what was happening in the 1500s tonight, then when you take that question that free response question on the AP exam, it's going to be, maybe it's a Renaissance question, maybe it's a Reformation question, you've still got that, you know what else is going on around it. Oftentimes, that can be the difference between a real high-scoring essay and a pretty pedestrian essay. Also, as I've instructed my students, sometimes it's a good idea, if you're feeling really confident, some of the best scores I've ever had are students who will take the really obscure off-the-wall question, which might be 16th century witchcraft, for example, was offered up about 15 years ago. 16th century witchcraft is something that I don't teach, and I doubt that John does either. So Jordan doesn't teach it, I don't teach it, but guess what? You can probably talk about everything else happening in the 1600s. And my students took that just for fun, and all scored extremely high on it, because what they were looking for is obviously the challenge of the Reformation led to the breakdown of the feelings in the church, and the breakdown of the feelings in the church led people to do other things like explore Protestantism, but also consider other things like witchcraft. And that ended up being a very, very strong essay. And that's because, remember that on the AP exam, you're not graded. You are ranked with all the other people that choose the question that you choose. So in each case, the DBQ is ranked on every person that takes a DBQ. The free response questions are all ranked. And so I have to get there 4 days before the reading actually starts, and we have to sit down as table leaders and read all these exams and get a rubric set as far as what a 9 is and what a 0 is and what everything is in between. And so we have to find a high 0 that's still a 0, and we have to find a low 9 and make that our standard, and then go and fill it in from there. That exam is not a valid exam if we don't have an equal number of all those numbered scores. So you're not really competing against the history, you're competing against people you're taking it with. So with that in mind, that led me to this, which is just kind of the sit-down discussion over a particular 100-year period, just to give you that solid background. So let's go ahead and dive right in, and we'll probably be out of here within the hour. We've got Rasmussen in Praise of Folly as one of the early works of the Reformation. And remember that about Erasmus and Praise of Folly, that Erasmus did not, he was good friends with Luther. They corresponded quite often. And there's record of correspondence between Erasmus and Luther, but Erasmus of Rotterdam was unlike Luther in that he was able to criticize the Catholic Church much the same way Luther was, but Erasmus did it with a little more dexterity. He chose to use comedy, he chose to use satire, and Erasmus was not willing to go the level that Luther was willing to go, which was to have an active debate. And I think part of that is because Erasmus is a little more insulated, because Luther, of course, is going to have to deal with Johann Tetzel and the indulgences, and that's what absolutely screws Luther into the ceiling and causes him to kind of sit down and write the 95 Theses. So anyway, contemporary of Luther, and their friendship is going to be strained and then ultimately severed as things are going to go in a different route for Luther. You can see 1516 is a concordat in Bologna between Leo X. Let's please remember that Leo X is the first Medici Pope, and he's the first lay Pope as well. So he's kind of the example of papal corruption, but he's not nearly as bad as the Borgia popes were in terms of their behavior and their conduct in office. But at the same time, he's the first one that has absolutely no ecclesiastic background whatsoever. He's also going to be the guy who's going to tap Michelangelo to do the Last Judgment, which, of course, he didn't want to do. The Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges and King Francis I, again, is going to move the Catholic French Church back toward the direction of the Vatican. And the last one, we had the earlier Pragmatic Sanction that kind of split the French Church after Avignon, split the French Church back toward the direction of a little bit of autonomy from Rome, and now it's going to be moving back and closer. Thomas Moran, Utopia, really a great work of the Renaissance, in that Utopia it kind of introduces us to Thomas More, and of course he'll play a huge role in ultimately what will be the device between the divisive moment between Henry VIII and Sir Thomas, and establishes himself as a great man of integrity, but also a very strong Catholic, and also a man who desires to see his land of Britannia become more efficiently governed. 1517 is, of course, the big date, and you can see that two things are happening in 1517. It's really a watershed year, maybe the most important year of the 1500s, because everybody remembers the Reformation, but don't forget that Machiavelli is also going to publish The Prince, and that will be hitting the Gutenberg press as the first real work of non-ecclesiastic, totally secular in nature, and also is going to be mass-produced. Which, remember, the big thing about the Gutenberg press is, of course, getting the Vulgate copied over and over and over. So the Vulgate Bible is the most published thing on the Gutenberg press, but right behind it is going to be the Prince, and it's still a very important piece of Renaissance work. Some of you suffered through it quite badly. 1518, Baldassare completes the Book of the Courtier. And remember, the Book of the Courtier is going to be the work that's going to really kind of begin to draw that we'll talk in the next lecture. We'll talk about elite and popular culture. We saw the movie Amadeus, and we looked at the differences in elite and popular cultures, how they dressed, how they acted. It's becoming more and more difficult to define, because as people become more literate, as they have access to Baldassare and this work of the Courtier, we begin learning about public behavior and how a person should act in a more civil world. Okay, you can see the next year, 1518, Luther is asked to recant the 95 points that he's made against the church. Of course, he does not do that. He's hoping for and he will receive a debate that won't be until 1521. That didn't turn out to be much of a debate at Worms, but he's hoping for that, and he's actively looking forward to a healthy debate with the church. He'll be taking on everybody that is of any ecclesiastic virtue from the Vatican, and he'll handle them quite nicely in 1521 to no real gain. 1519, you've got Magellan. You've also got Cortez with the Aztecs, and you've got a great piece of historiography there. And if you do recall that, depending on which side you want to sit on that issue with Cortez and the Aztecs, and the Judeo-Christian view of the Aztecs and the Aztec view of the Christians is a nice piece. If you're asked to articulate anything about that, that's a good one to talk about historiography and how the story is really told. Who's right, who's wrong? We know that the Spanish are going to acquire Aztec gold. We also know that the Aztecs, did a lot of human sacrifice, and this upset the conquistadores quite a bit. Let's also remember that there's no way that as the story has been told from somewhat of a politically correct, sanitized version, there's no way that the conquistadores could have possibly conquered the Aztecs with 300 men against 100,000 warriors. So you understand that the big part of the conquistadores is their political skills and their ability to unite the tribes around the Aztecs. Okay, likely? No, I don't think, but you never know what they're going to come up with on the AP exam. You can see that in 1520, Luther is officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and his removal will then take him from a role as active professor and lecturer and scholar and priest to that of somewhat on the outside, and he'll be somewhat he's going to stay in the he'll be cloistered from 1520 to 1521 only because he's awaiting for his time. As you see in 1521, he's going to hopefully be excited that he's going to be able to go across Germany to Worms, and that's when of course the great Frederick the Wise of Saxony is going to realize that his young Luther is not going to have a chance to survive a trip across the Germanic states. So he's going to ask for young Charles V, the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. I think Charles V is all of like 17, 18 years old, something like that. He's very young, and he's going to want a guarantee of Luther's safe passage to Worms in 1521. Luther gets it. He goes to Worms. He's assuming he's going to get a debate. He's looking forward to it, and he's immediately slapped with 72 counts of heresy. Charles V proclaims him an outlaw, and he's slapped into chains and thrown in the dungeon and narrowly escaped being burned at the stake the next morning if it were not for Charles the Wise and that's why you get called Charles the Wise. Frederick the Wise. 1524, Luther really took this hard, by the way. When word of Luther's excommunication and ultimately his removal and then the start of the Protestant faith of Lutheranism, Luther was devastated to find out that so many peasants, over 100,000 peasants, had gone completely off the rails and across Germany and across most of the Holy Roman Empire. We really don't know how many clerics were killed, but they stormed cathedrals, they smashed stained glass, they killed priests, they killed nuns, and Luther was aghast. He tried to give announcements and try to call this thing off and try to stop them from doing that, but there was no real stopping it. And there's a really great story about Luther ended up finding his future bride, who had been she was in a convent. She was a nun, and they had been attacked by peasants. And a really kind businessman was traveling through, and he had pickle barrels, and it was herring, and he literally dumped the fish out of the barrels, and he shoved the nuns down in the herring barrels, and sealed them back up, and they rode across the countryside and brought them all the way back to Wittenberg, and then broke open the barrels, and Luther looked at her and said, well, she smells terrible, but she's really cute. He got married, and they got busy and had about 8 kids. So it was kind of a warm into it, but that was a very, very tough time in 1524. 1527, a sidebar, I think, the sack of Rome by Charles V. Strange event, because obviously there's disagreement between Charles V and Leo. You can see Henry VIII petitions Pope Clement for a divorce of Catherine of Aragon. Can anybody tell me why that didn't go too well? Yeah, Rachel?
Wasn't
Yeah.
Catherine? Wasn't he related to Spain?
Correct. She's the daughter of Ferdinand.
Wasn't
Yeah.
Catherine? Wasn't he related to Spain?
Correct. She's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Good. And what else had happened to her?
She couldn't have a son, right?
Yeah. We know better, right? We know that it's not about the female, whether or not you have a son. It's really Henry, but that was the claim against her. But what had already happened to her once? Well, not a divorce. Remember, we're in the Catholic Church. She had an annulment, and so she was married to Henry's older brother. They gave her an annulment once so that she could marry Henry, and they've had a little girl, and he's wanting a divorce or another annulment, and that no, there isn't enough gold to get that one done. So that's going to be why there's going to be a break in the 1527 will be the beginning of the break from the Catholic Church in England and the beginning of the Anglican Church. 1529, the German Lutheran princes are going to protest the decrees, and this is where you get the term Protestant. You see that the word protest is buried into it. So that's the beginning, the official beginning of the Protestant or the Lutheran Church. Luther is going to stay in Dresden, where he'll be preaching for the rest of his life, and that cathedral is just been finished, thanks to a lot of money sent from Columbus, Ohio, because we're the sister city, and helped them get that finished. It's a beautiful cathedral in Dresden. Okay, 1530, Archbishop of Canterbury, that's Thomas Cranmer, annuls the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. That's because they now have a new church, the Anglican Church of England, which is entirely like the Catholic Church, except that the king can get a divorce. So, yeah. 1534, there's your act of supremacy, completes the English Reformation. Of course, you know that, again, the quite famous now Saint Sir Thomas More is the only one who, I will say, he did not refuse. He remained silent to not take the act of supremacy. We've got the Anabaptists coming in, and let's see, there's Michelangelo in 1534 to 41 doing the Last Judgment. That's an interesting piece because interesting to see if they'll ask an art question. Sometimes they do. Typically, when they do, they stay very, very mainstream with it. When I say mainstream, they ask that they stay with Renaissance art, they do Baroque art, they might do Impressionism, or you may see, it's possible you could see Picasso or Salvador Dali or a piece of Surrealism, something like that. But that's usually about it. They tend not, every art piece that I've ever seen on the AP exam has been something that we've already looked at, or it's easily recognizable and not really, really abstract. So that's favorable. I would just exercise great caution if you see art or you see pictures or things like that on the DBQ. Just be careful and don't overanalyze something. Just visual things can be tricky, and make sure if you're really, really confident, then do that. The Last Judgment may be his most spectacular painting that he ever did, but he didn't want to do it, and the only way he did it was, of course, they threatened his life. They said, you're going to be dispatched to heaven, or you're going to come paint again on the Sistine Chapel, so he did reluctantly.
That's on the back wall, right?
Well, yeah, it's actually the front wall.
Oh,
It's the front of the chapel. So it feels like it because when you walk to the Vatican Museum into the Sistine Chapel, you have to kind of make a U-turn. Yes, you walk under the doorway, and you're right there with Cardinal Riario and the serpent eating his genitals right over your head when you walk in the room. So it's kind of a strange configuration is how you walk in. But yeah, I think it's, for everybody that claims the ceiling is so remarkable, I think that always bows me over whenever I go in there. So it's got to be on your bucket list. Got to do that one. Here comes John Calvin, 1536. Calvin's going to be an important figure if you're going to do anything on the Reformation because, let's be honest, if there's any Reformation question, every kid writing on it's going to write about Luther. What's going to separate you from anybody else? Yeah, sure, you need to know your Luther, absolutely, because he's the primary architect. When you can get Calvin, you have the opportunity to make some good, solid ecclesiastic and philosophical discussion about the idea of predestination, the idea of omnipotence, the idea of omnipresence, and you don't want to take much time on it, but again, that's something that a lot of kids don't understand and don't know. Calvin, one of the really great writers of this time, wrote 12 volumes of work. I mean, the guy was an extraordinary writer. but also pretty broad. And that's a good opportunity. I mean, you can go to the extreme and talk about the Puritans and the really strict Calvinists, and you can go all the way down the pike to the Presbyterians and the most liberal Calvinists. And you have an opportunity to talk about the role of faith and fate, and that predestination, that according to Calvin, God has a plan for you, and at some point it's going to be revealed to you, and your life will be different forever and ever, and that's the nutshell of predestination. And that's going to be different than Lutheran Protestantism. And Calvinism is going to be, very, very broadly interpreted, and it's going to be spread all across Europe. And the Calvinists are going to be the real thorn in the side when we get to the 30 Years' War and we get to other things. So I think that's important. I think also mentioning that the breadth of the Reformation spanning a longer period than what we really know or talk about in the 1500s. Notice there's 1540 and the Jesuit Order is founded. Let's try to remember that we've got the Council of Trento, 1545, but the Council of Trento is a 10-year meeting, and one of the important outcomes of the Council of Trento is the Jesuit Order. And the Jesuit Order is still around today, and it's still thriving. And it's an outstanding order in terms of what its actual message is. It's really the most positive thing that comes out of this time for the Catholic Church. And the really smart recognition that the Catholic Church is going to come out, and Ignatius Loyola is going to say, look, the future of the Catholic Church is not going to be going back and reconverting a bunch of people that have already gone over to the Protestant faith. We've lost that flock. Our goal is to get the next generation and begin opening institutions of higher learning and begin training young men to be priests and try to really make a really rich educational curriculum and ecclesiastic curriculum for them moving forward. And the Jesuit Order's pretty much done that ever since. And so they're a real bright spot. The dark spot, the contrast to that, of course, is going to be the Inquisition, the Holy Inquisition, and securing confession by torture, and that piece. So, that's where we're going with the Council of Trent. Notice 1543, right in the middle there, we've got the introduction to the scientific revolution with Copernicus. A lot of people like to talk about Newton a lot with the scientific revolution. I think that Copernicus may again be a stronger choice, only because if you have the opportunity to discuss the impact of Copernicus and his intellect, his understanding that here's a man who's just trying to find a calendar, he's trying to get Easter 10 years out, and nobody else can do it, and he's going to do it because he changes the order of the planets and defies the book of Genesis. And he is, of course, the true first revolutionary, because his model refers to the earth as not the center of the universe, but in fact something that is revolving around the sun. And it is truly revolutionary, and he's smart enough to know that he can't possibly publish his work. He gives the Vatican what they want, he gives them their calendar. Here you go, and oh yeah, by the way, I'm still compiling my data, and I'll get it to you as soon as I can. And they wait till he's on his deathbed, they hand him his book, he weeps over it, and he hands it back to his wife, and he dies. So that was smart. Kept him from being burned at the stake. It's all written in Latin. Again, very smart, because they can bury it in the archive. Nobody's going to find it until this guy Galileo comes along 100 and some years later, and he creates another firestorm. But the point of this is, and there's, if my son was watching, he could tell me the guy. There was another Italian who also found Copernicus' work and got in extraordinary trouble for it. He argued the same thing. The geocentric model is obsolete.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is like his Cosmos series, I think, mentioned it.
It's it. Yes, that's exactly because he watches it faithfully. And I want to say Fermi, but it's not Fermi. It's like that though.
Italian.
Yeah. Alex, take your headset off. Take your headset off. Who is the Italian? Do you remember the Italian who got in trouble for supporting Copernicus? No. Darn it. See, you had your shot, man. You're gonna make AP Euro history, and yeah, well, to prove the old man stupid. No, you didn't do it. Okay. All right. 1545, Council of Trent, whatever you want to call it. I call it Trento. John Knox and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. Remember, Knox is a strong follower of Calvin, and that's that really cool reality that there's no way that John Knox can go back to Scotland and tell the Scots that they can't drink whiskey, they can't play their music, and they can't wear kilts. So the Presbyterians are formed out of that. And so is a tradition that Saturday night will be the night that you can wear your kilts and drink your whiskey and play your damn bagpipes, but on Sunday be quiet and be in church and wear plain clothes. And it works. Works pretty well. 1555. Please, notice I have that one in bold. I've got the two real important religious documents in bold. Extraordinarily important that you know 1555 in Augsburg, because that's going to be the document that the 30 Years' War keeps revolving around. And that's the first real document of, granted, limited religious freedom in Europe. But that's going to establish that all the German princes are finally going to be able to choose if they want to worship through Catholicism or the Lutheran Church. Notice there's no provision for Calvinists at all. But that's really, really important, because not only being the first document of religious freedom for Europe, it's also, and this is where you could discuss this and just say, it's a clear indication that the effort to destroy the Protestant faith is just, there's a degree to which they've said enough. We're not going to be able to do it. And like to think that's, okay, this is now the success of the Protestant movement, the Protestant Reformation. However, what's coming, is 1618 and the Defenestration of Prague and the beginning of a whole other firestorm that looks like it's going to stamp this thing out. But from 1555 on until 1618, you have relative peace in the Holy Roman Empire and a degree of coexistence between Lutheran and Catholic municipalities, principalities, and really it's not as regional as one would think. Yes, it's true that the southern German states like Bavaria and the bigger states are going to remain Catholic, and it's also true that the northern German states like Prussia and Mecklenburg and some of the others, Baden, are going to stay Protestant. But the rest of it is really hit and miss throughout all the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, 1556. This, I think, is another piece that it is tied to Augsburg. It can be right on the heels of Augsburg, and that's the end of Charles V. We started talking about Charles V at the beginning of the 1500s. Now we're at 1556, and Charles V is going to abdicate. You don't see that very often. This is the most powerful man in the world. Think about where Spain is in 1555, 1556. He's the guy that signs the Peace of Augsburg. He's the guy that said enough of the fighting, enough of the killing, peace in the Holy Roman Empire. He's also the king of Spain. And in 1556, he steps down. He just quits. It's extraordinary. Not only does he quit, but he basically checks himself into a monastery where they're going to have a vow of silence. He never says another word. He's in prayer every day. He takes he takes confession every day, but he can't confess. He's in a vow of silence. He goes and sits through Mass, takes the Eucharist. He does all that. He's miserable, and he's dead soon after. It's extraordinary. So his son is going to get Spain. That's going to be Philip II, and his brother Maximilian is going to get the Holy Roman Empire. I don't know of many. I can't think of another case in any part of history where somebody just willingly just stepped down from such a position of power. There's no decline. There's no, but he saw that as a divisive moment in his life, and I probably saw it as a personal failure. Mr. Fagan.
Diocletian.
Oh yeah, that's right. Diocletian did when he split Rome. Thank you. About 385, wasn't it? 385. Yeah. But I think he wanted to live in the East. I think he liked Constantinople better, or Byzantium at the time. Okay, now notice that we're going to go from we've been spending a lot of time in the Holy Roman Empire because so far this has all been pretty much HRE stuff and religious Protestant Reformation, Counter-Reformation stuff. Now look where we're going. Now we're heading over to France. And we're talking about the conflict between the Huguenots. Let's remember between the Huguenots. Let's remember the Huguenots are French Calvinists. Okay, Huguenots are French Calvinists. And certainly France is still a predominantly Catholic country. And that's going to lead to civil wars. That's going to really be a mess. French history is really tough. That's going to end with, and jump to 1598, with the Edict of Nantes, or l'Edit de Nantes, or the Edict of Nantes, for those of you that habla español, can't stand French. Okay. So that's going to be a big deal. That's going to be obviously going to be the rise of Henri IV, Henry of Navarre. So that's coming as well in the 1500s. Notice that we have Lepanto coming up in 1571, and that is a good time for us to talk about the golden age of Spain, because in the last lecture we talked about 1492, making sure you knew that 1492, more importantly than Columbus sailing the ocean blue, was the Reconquista. But now it's time for us to really talk about that other side of 1492 and the Spanish acquisition of tremendous wealth and opportunity and great power. True that the Spanish kind of squandered that economically, but certainly no one can argue the fact that Spain is, through the 1500s, an extraordinarily powerful and very, very wealthy country. Also, it's important to realize that as they become more and more powerful and they build their mighty navy, the Spanish Armada, to a larger and larger extent, they're going to eventually come into contact with the only other real viable navy that could give them real trouble, and that's going to be the Ottoman Turkish Navy. And the Ottoman Turkish Navy and the Spanish Armada are going to face off in a very major battle at 1571 at a place in the Aegean Sea, at a place called Lepanto. And the Spanish were lucky. They had the wind at their back, and they had a very aggressive commander, Don Juan. And the center of their fleet is going to take advantage of the Ottomans, and they're going to fold the Ottomans into a terrible bloodletting, continuing to use the range on their cannon with the wind at their back and a strong wind and gale force winds, and defeat the Armada. So 1571 is kind of the real, not to be too cliche, but the real high water mark for the Spanish and their Armada. I would say the peak of Spanish power is going to be somewhere 1571, 1574, right in that range right there, where the Spanish are the true hegemon of the Mediterranean. They're the hegemon of the Atlantic. The Pacific's just too big. I can't really even comment about it. I mean, they're all over. They're obviously, you know that the Philippine Islands are named for Philip II, one of the strongest Catholic states even in the world today. So, you know, the Spanish were everywhere. They were also, you know, universally known as kind of the bad guy of imperialism, but at the same time, we can't argue their success and their extreme wealth. They really did it well in every single way except how they managed their money. It's just absolutely tragic that they turned around and just made gold coins and just threw them in the ocean, literally. But that being said, we'll ride the Spanish tide until the time comes when you see the next thing coming at 1588, and the ultimate real debacle for the Spanish is going to be the decision to get involved with basically letting your ego get the best of you and decide that you're going to go ahead and attack Great Britain. Recall that was due to Elizabeth for the most part. Elizabeth is not mentioned on here. I should have her in there, but she's pretty much the source of English success, and I think that she deserves her rightful place as one of the really. I'm personally, I think she's the greatest monarch that England ever had, and I think that they began to appreciate her wisdom when they started to acquire ports, as they will in 1715. We'll be talking about that when we get to Utrecht. But within the framework of what we want to know in the 1500s, England is on the rise. Spain is clearly at the top, and it is reasonable to know and reasonable to assume that Elizabeth would do everything that she can to try to be as friendly as she possibly can with the Spanish. That's not going to be easy, considering her older sister is Bloody Mary, and that she was a bitter Catholic. Elizabeth is technically Anglican, but I would say she's almost a-religious in terms of her preference. I think that Elizabeth is probably the most open-minded monarch of her time as far as religious preferences and problems that can stem from that. There's going to be a large Jewish population in England at the time of Elizabeth. There's going to be a lot of things happening in England during her time, and of course you know about Shakespeare and all the great things that are happening in that period. Extraordinary person, but also very realistic. When she starts to run guns into the Dutch Netherlands to support the revolt and support William of Orange, William the Silent as we know him, she had to understand the risk that she was running. And yet she did it anyway, because she felt that it was important that England help out this Protestant revolt. I think that there's probably a good legal argument. I'm not legally trained, but I think that if you were alive in 1588 and you were in the Dutch Netherlands, you'd be extraordinarily frustrated when the Edict of Peace of Westphalia, when the Peace of Augsburg comes out in 1555. You're sitting in the Dutch Netherlands. The King of Spain is your guy. Charles V is Dutch. He speaks Dutch. He's the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He just signed an instrument of religious freedom for the HRE. You can probably sit outside your window in the Dutch Netherlands and see the Holy Roman Empire from there, and yet you don't have religious freedom, and you're forced to be Catholic. Of course they were upset. And that begins a divide, which becomes the Union of Utrecht that William the Silent, or William of Orange I, is going to lead. Elizabeth empathized with that, and she saw an opportunity. At the same time, she's writing love letters to Philip and taking full advantage of his favor and his desire to marry her. So she was smart about that, and she knew that she was probably on borrowed time. Once Philip started to put two and two together, he realized that he had been hoodwinked by Elizabeth. The wrath of the Spanish Armada and ultimately the conquistadores and everything else that's going to be coming down on England occurred. So, in 1588, the mighty Spanish Armada set sail out of Corunna, and they put in for what they hoped would be the young ragtag English Navy that had been doing some pretty bad things to them on the high seas, including Drake and Hawkins and some other of those sea dogs that were dropping their colors and hoisting pirate flags and doing all kinds of things. Yeah, the Spanish wanted a pound of flesh. The plan for the invasion was really extraordinarily complicated, because Philip is going to demand that the Armada, sail into harm's way, destroy the English Navy outside probably Land's End, somewhere where the waters are favorable, then sail in through the Channel, go into the Dutch Netherlands, gather the forces, their military forces, the conquistadors and others, and then sail right up the Thames River and attack London, pulling in through the dockyards. There's a lot of things in that plan. That's a very, very elaborate plan, and of course, when elaborate plans are made without alternatives, things can happen. Drake and his fireboats change the course of history. Protestant winds, gale force winds come in and blow the Spanish Armada deeper and deeper into the Channel. It becomes a high-pitched naval battle through the night, and then as the Spanish realize they can't maneuver by daybreak, they decide to go ahead and make the rush. They go through the Straits of Dover. They try to go around and shoot their way through, and lo and behold, when they made the turn at the Orkney Islands at the top of Scotland, they hit a massive storm, and their damaged ships were sunk at sea. I think they started with, I don't remember the exact number, but you guys remember, there was like 140 some ships. They come back, they limp home with 27 ships, and they're never going to recover. Their 445-ton galleons are going to be basically just annihilated. They did stop in Ireland and get refitted there and get some supplies, because Irish were sympathetic to the Spanish, but they're done. That is probably the moment in history where you begin to see the real decline of Spain. 1588 is not officially in the textbook. They say the golden age will be from 1492 to 1650, but the decline is very, very slow. But they lose their ability to be the hegemon on the high seas after 1588. So that's a real watershed year. The very next year, 1589, you have a really big change in France. France is going to make the turn from the House of Valois, who I made a little fun of and mocked a little bit, and just because of its extraordinary inefficiency and their poor leadership, into the House of Bourbon. And unless you're from Kentucky, it's the Bourbon family, but we can say Bourbon. And this new dynasty, unfortunately for the French, really, I think it's fair to say that their finest king is their first king. Because remember that Henri IV bridged that gap between, he grew up as a Huguenot in Navarre, he converted to Catholicism, he married into the Medici family, he became full Catholic, but here's a guy that never forgot his roots. He hires the Duke of Soleil to be his Minister of Finance, and it's extraordinary what France is able to do. Because with the leadership of Henri IV and the wise choices made by Duke de Soleil, for the only time in French history, they're able to put a surplus in their treasury, and their country is really moving in a very positive direction financially, and they're very, very strong. And then unfortunately, Henri IV in 1610 will be assassinated by a crazed monk who will stab him in the liver and kill him. And then that's when his wife Marie de Medici will take over. I believe Louis XIII is like 4 years old. He's a young little dauphin, and then she's going to pretty much then hire Richelieu, and they're going to pretty much start the run on the bank, and the French will never be out of debt, ever again. So finally, we have l'Édit de Nantes, the Edict of Nantes, which was kind of the capstone of the reign of Henry IV. Henry IV had decided that it was important for France to begin moving in a direction of religious toleration. There already was a document, of course. We have Augsburg from 1555, so there was a document of religious toleration already in place. Henry IV was inspired by this. Let's be honest, this is a guy who grew up Huguenot. He became Catholic. He's got a Huguenot minister of finance. It's a perfectly logical policy decision for him. And you're able to see a degree of confidence come from the Huguenot, because remember that l'Édit de Nantes, or the Edict of Nantes, is a very, very significant religious document because it has more teeth to it than any other document that's been passed before that. And what I say is, remember, the first portion of l'Édit de Nantes is giving religious freedom to the Huguenots unconditionally. And then the second part of it is the one that allows them to fortify their towns and castles. And that's really big, because that's going to be that important piece where they're going to say the king is putting his money where his mouth is. He's saying not only can you have religious freedom, but you can defend that religious freedom. Establish your municipalities, put up your fortifications, set up your cannonade, set up your oblique lines of fire, and protect yourself. What that does is provide France with a Protestant engine that is going to further their economy and make them even more successful. And that's why one of the great criticisms of Richelieu, and then of course it's going to be Louis XIV, who will bring this thing down in 1685. Richelieu will be the first one to chop it up in 1629 with his Edict of Restitution in the middle of the 30 Years' War. And then Louis XIV will just completely tear it down. And that killed the French economy. And everybody told Louis XIV not to do that. This was a very sound document and a very good document. When the French abandoned the l'Édit de Nantes in 1685, it's what a lot of French believe the seed is sown for the French Revolution, because hundreds of thousands of Huguenots are going to flee and leave and go elsewhere, and they're going to take their wealth with them, and that's unfortunate reality. But I think it's an important piece. That takes us through the 1500s. Any questions, Tom?
What year did you just say all of them leave?
1685 is when they bailed. And that began to be the real big deficit. Remember, that again, we'll get to the French Revolution and talk about that separately. But remember that too many students think that the end of the French Revolution occurs because of Versailles, and court costs. In reality, it's Louis's wars, but also that one decision that Louis made in 1685 to revoke the entire Edict of Nantes and force all those Huguenots out. You're taking, like they said, the brains of France out of the economy, took their wealth with them and left.
There was like 300,000, right?
Sounds right. Yeah, they are all business leaders, business owners and leaders. And
What was the French family before Bourbon?
Valois or Valois, V-A-L-O-I-S.
That
I
helps
know.
a lot.
Duc de Soleil is Duc de Sully.
Oh,
Valois is Valois. Bourbon is Bourbon.
I spelled it like
Too many of you
a circus
Espanol.
company.
Too many of you are taking Spanish. You really got. We need more French. We need German. We need Japanese back. We need Russian back. Everybody's taking
That's what
Spanish.
you can do. Instead of retirement, you can teach Russian.
Thank you.
What we really need is Chinese.
You could do
They'd still make me do SLOs. No. Okay. Any questions? Any other questions? Anything else? Look at that. You're free. You're free. Thank you for coming in.
I looked up the guy from the Cosmos thing.
Yeah.
His name was Giordano Bruno.
Bruno, thank you. It's Bruno, yes. You looked that up?
Yeah.
Amazing. You astonish me.
I really wanted to know.
Yeah, because it was Bruno. Yeah, I was thinking, yep.